Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for our third public meeting on the 287 Bus Rapid Transit being headed up by Boulder County. And we are working with many partners on this. Some of them, most of them are listed below. I'd like to thank all of them. The City of Longmont, Erie, Lafayette, and City County Broomfield, RTD, Colorado Department of Transportation, Fort Collins, City of Loveland, Commuting Solutions, FTA or Federal Transit Administration. We also have the Denver Regional Council of Governments and the town of Berthoud or city of Berthoud. And so thank you all for helping us make this possible tonight. This would not be possible without the help of all of our partners, and it has been a great process with all of your input and input from the public as well. So thank you to all the public for participating, and thank you to our partners. And so I will go over the agenda here. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Nick. My name is Jeff Butts. I am the project manager with Boulder County. We also have Nick Vanderquack, who is the project manager with AECOM. And he will be presenting tonight, and then I will come back at the end. And he's going to be giving a project update and talking about the screening metrics and talking about the screening and then the metrics that we have used for determining the best routing and stations and things, their recommendations, and then I will talk about implementation and next steps. And this is going to be in English and in Spanish, so I am going to post to the chat information here about how to do it. And I'm going to talk in Spanish for just 1 second. Si quieren verlo en español, ese tiene interpretación y ve al chat para como escuchar ese en español. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Nick. You're muted, Nick.
Apologize for that. Hello, everybody. Nick Vanderquack here again with AECOM. We're excited to give you an update on the project that the project team and the partners that Jeff had mentioned have been working on for the last several months. We're nearing the end of the feasibility study that we've been working on, and so we're excited to share some of the results of the initial study that we've been doing. And so I'm going to be talking about some of that tonight. Before I get into that, just to give a little
Nick,
bit of,
excuse me, can you go a little bit slower?
I can go slower. Yep.
Thanks.
So wanted to start with a little background on this project. The Northwest Area Mobility Study that was done 6 or 7 years ago really studied the whole Northwest region in terms of the transit potential and the opportunities for improvements with BRT and rail and all sorts of things. And a key outcome of that study was the US 287 BRT corridor. It came out as a very likely candidate that would have a really good outcome with significant transit investment. And so I have some stats shown here that were calculated as part of that study. And we have some updates today based off of the additional detail and things that we learned from stakeholders and others through the process that we'll be talking about in terms of things like number of people using the services, number of boardings, how much they cost, and travel times, and a bunch of other things that start to look at that. So this study has been really important, has framed this study as we've been moving forward. So to outline what this study encompasses, it's a rather large corridor, especially when you look at this map on the right here. The core area of the corridor where we're focused on looking at specific changes and capital improvements to the corridor is between Longmont and Broomfield. But an important piece of transit is regional connections and integration with other transit services. So as part of that, we've also looked at what does express service look like along 287 that connects all the way to Fort Collins, as well as all the way down to Denver. And so we've included some transit routings in our study that cover some of those connections. And that's been really important as we seek to understand the north-south benefits of BRT investment along the corridor. Some of the latest developments, if you haven't been to the project website before, please go check it out. It's at boco.org/287 planning. On that website, we've posted a number of materials for the project, including the stations area toolkit, which we talked about in our last meeting a little bit, but it covers some general concepts for stations in general, specifically on the 287 corridor, but also other locations in the county and elsewhere. There's a lot of good information and details surrounding stations there. So we've got that posted. We've also gone through the scenario modeling and evaluation metrics, which I'm talking about today with you all. And so we'll be capturing that. And we've gone through some cost estimating, looking at how much do these capital improvements cost, as well as some of the details on how much it costs to operate these services that we're talking about on an annual basis. And then we've got today's public meeting, which is great. Happy to be talking with you here. And later this month, we'll be finalizing the feasibility study, and that will be available in mid-December to late December as we finish that up. It's not the end of this process. It's the kind of culmination of the feasibility study. There's a lot more to come on 287 that Boulder County will be continuing to work forward with. So tonight we're right at this public meeting 3 milestone, pretty close to the end, and we'll be having that report that gets published here with some of these results we're talking about tonight. And then Boulder County will be transitioning into a next phase of study along 287, which Jeff will talk a bit more at the end as we get to that point. So to dive in on some of the details of the screening and the metrics, I'm going to start off. So we've gone through kind of an iterative process to develop what BRT could look like on US 287. And with that, and working with the community, working through a series of public meetings, as well as talking to a variety of community groups and organizations and stakeholders and the other agencies represented along the corridor, we've come up with 3 basic service patterns that all would operate at the same time along this corridor. So I'm going to describe those to you for some background here, and they're shown on this map on the right. But essentially, looking at that Fort Collins Express transit service connection all the way to Denver Union Station is this blue line. And the way we've looked at that is a more express service with a stop, basically a stop in each community along the way, but more limited stops than some of the other service patterns. We've also looked at this orange service pattern, which is basically the connection between Longmont and Broomfield, with some additional stops in between versus that express service. And then also some recognizing that there's a lot of transit activity on the southern end between Lafayette and Broomfield, looking at some additional supplemental service there. So when you overlay all of these services on top of each other, you end up with a level of service that ranges from 7.5 minutes, so a bus coming every 7.5 minutes, up to 30 minutes at some of the express stations to the north and the south. And those range depending upon which station you're at and which service patterns are servicing that. So it's quite a bit of detail that has gone into combining these together, and there can be changes in the future, but this is the assumptions that we made in our process that really has been informed by a variety of folks and users. With that, with those particular service patterns, the next step, the tier 2 scenarios that we have been focusing on is looking at specifically capital investments along US 287 at the stations and also at the intersections along the way, and trying to capture as you make changes in the capital improvements, what do those look like in terms of a lot of the indicators like ridership and cost and other things like that, travel time. And so we divided the scenarios that we evaluated up into these three kind of color-coded scenarios. These will be coded this way throughout the presentation for reference. The first one is operational improvements, and that's a scenario that looked at taking what's out there right now, the existing LD service, and making some improvements to the operations that make it run faster. So changing up what stops that stops at, what stops are used for the route, and the pattern that route to make it most efficient by staying on US 287. And you'll see the results of that in our analysis. We also took a look at scenario 2, which is mixed flow bus rapid transit. And so that's starting to see the impact of premium transit service at the stations along the corridor, as well as investments at the intersections to make the intersection buses operate a lot faster at the intersections as they go through. And then the last scenario we looked at was that same scenario as above with some additional business access transit lanes, which I'll describe in a bit here what those are, but it makes the bus move through congestion faster, is the short story of that. So to describe that queue, the queue jumps and the intersection improvements in a bit more detail, about what we assumed at the various intersections along the corridor. This slide here demonstrates a couple of different ways that buses can improve their travel time and operations around intersections by having some improvements done. I'm not going to go into all the technical details surrounding this, but basically the way that the bus communicates with the signals, we call it TSP, it allows the bus to control the signal in a way to get priority. And so the bus can move through the intersection. If it's running behind, it can change the signal, things like that, and go through that shown in this first graphic. The second one is looking at actually building an additional turn, a right turn lane, shared right turn lane with the bus, and maybe extending it back so that at intersections where there's a lot of congestion, buses can move through and bypass that by going into that lane and then using the signal to get through in a priority weight as well. And the last one is similarly having that bus stay in its own lane as it crosses through the intersection. And so that's just to give a little primer on how that works. The other thing I mentioned that we looked at in our last scenario is BAT lanes. And so there are several locations along the corridor that already have right turn lanes or acceleration lanes that exist, that if you were to connect those together and extend the pavement, you could essentially have a space where the bus could continually stay on the right-hand side and be more efficient as it moves through traffic in that way. And so this scenario assumes the additions of those types of lanes in these locations listed in Longmont, Lafayette, and Broomfield. A key point of looking at transit growth is also looking at how the demographics are changing, how population is growing, and how employment is growing along the corridor. And there's a lot of information shown here about what we looked at. But generally, over the next 25 years, both of those are growing in this corridor, or are forecasted to grow from the regional models. And so we want to, one of Boulder County's goals is to outpace that growth with transit growth. So having transit grow by a ratio of 2 to 1 to what population and employment is growing. So it wants to keep up pace, but also have additional people using transit than were using it before. And so to meet those goals, we've got that number defined below, which you'll see in a bit here. Our ridership estimates end up being quite a bit higher than this, which is a great thing. It's showing that we're outpacing that goal if population and employment continues to grow this way. A key metric here that we're capturing is transit travel time. There's a lot of information on this chart, and we've conducted a lot of study, and we'll be documenting all of this into the report. But just to give a couple key highlights here, on the left, we've got the peak AM hour, which is shown here, and on the right, we've got the peak PM hour. and both northbound and southbound directions for each of those. And then we've got each scenario, the travel time in minutes that is being estimated by the models for the resultant transit travel time between those locations. And so the baseline is really and this is all looking off into the future. This is in 2045. So there's a lot of other changes happening regionally that the model is representing as well. So the big things to note here are that in the baseline, we're not making any changes to US 287, but as you look at simply just changing the operations of how the bus moves through and not really making capital improvements in that scenario one, you can shave a significant amount of time off as far as the travel time of the bus, which would make it more attractive and more usable for the folks that do use it. And that's consistent throughout the directions and the time periods that we looked at. The other key thing to think about here is that when you start to make capital improvements and start to enhance the BRT stops and other things at intersections, you are able to drop a significant number of travel time. Again, another 10 to 18 minutes is what we observed through the different scenarios, which is great. And then the last scenario here, looking at the BAT lanes, you save a lot of travel time at the intersections, but you can also save every little improvement will save you some increment travel time. And so adding on some additional pieces beyond that saves you another few minutes beyond what that other scenario has. This is showing the same thing only from Fort Collins to Denver. The same trend, we observed the same trends on this space, and we've got all that detail cataloged here. The good thing about investing on US 287 in Boulder County and in Broomfield is that any transit service that operates on this route will benefit from these improvements, not just any single one route. So this is showing that if you run that express pattern, if that were to exist, this is generally what the travel times would be looking into 2045 with a similar level of changes. And I didn't mention this on the last one, but we also looked at the drive times, the typical drive times. Those range quite a bit depending upon congestion. And so the goal here really is to get the bus transit travel time more similar to driving, or at least make it more competitive so it becomes a more viable choice for people that want to use it. I'm going to move into ridership and talking about the same scenarios and how they impacted transit ridership as far as what we looked at from the model. So those three different patterns listed here are the Longmont to Brimfield, the Lafayette to Brimfield, and the Fort Collins to Denver. There's some heat maps here that show a lot of information. The key thing to observe here is that for each of these different patterns, we want to really demonstrate where that ridership is coming from. And so this is showing that throughout all the scenarios, a significant amount of the ridership that was generated was in Broomfield on the south end. And also when you looked at that express pattern, Denver Union Station has a significant number of boardings. It's a heavily utilized connection for everyone along the route that are traveling to and from Denver Union Station. And then as you move north, Lafayette, Longmont, and then communities to the north on this northern route also had some ridership, people that were utilizing the route from Fort Collins and Loveland and other locations up to the north. To show it a little different way, this is the range of ridership that we observed in the model. It really, in the scenarios we looked at, it ranges from 3,800 riders up to 5,200. And so as you invest in the corridor, you're making it more attractive for people to use the service. You're making the travel time faster, which makes it more beneficial. And so this is showing that. This is also showing the breakdown of the three different transit service patterns. The dominant one making up that ridership is the express one. It becomes more attractive, and it's faster to get to where you want to go. It also includes Denver Union Station and Fort Collins in that pattern. We have a little less people using that Lafayette Broomfield connection on that particular service pattern. And then quite a few folks use the core Longmont to Broomfield pattern, but those all overlay with each other and add up to these totals that are shown on this slide. Of those making up these trips, the way that people got to stations is an important thing to look at. So as far as people, the dominant method of people getting to this route is actually transfers, showing that regional transit connections are really important to have those key transfer locations. More than half of the trips are made up of those transfers. And then about a third of the trips are made up of walk access, people living nearby the stations on the corridor. And then there's a fair number of people that are using drive access, either park and rides or having people drop them off as a portion of those numbers. Another important metric that we looked at is the throughput of people on the corridor, both from passenger vehicles as well as transit. So looking at the scenarios throughout, we can see that overall, this chart starts at 270,000. So it's not starting at 0, but this is looking at the number of people that are moving through US 287. And as we're investing in transit, we're increasing that total person throughput, which is great. It's allowing more people to be traveling on the corridor. Of that transit makeup, with the baseline, we're showing less than 1% of the folks that are utilizing or are traveling on US 287 are utilizing transit. But as you invest in the corridor, you're making it more attractive, you're increasing transit ridership, that number more than doubles. And so the transit mode share is really increasing as a part of these investments, which is really contributing towards the overall goals that the region has and Boulder County has, and really helps to boost transit ridership and growth in the region. Another important thing to look at with any investment is how that influences vehicle miles traveled and emissions, and how that can benefit our cleaner air and also reducing the number of vehicles miles that are on the road. So through our analysis, we are showing that investment in transit on US 287, it does change travel patterns, and it reduces the automobile generated vehicle miles traveled, which is a really good thing. Increased investment also increases the ridership. And so it decreases that automobile VMT as a result. The buses that are put on the corridor as part of this, they do also add vehicle miles traveled. And so the key item here to look at moving forward is what type of buses are deployed in any transit investment. So looking at low or no emission buses will continue to further reduce vehicle emissions, as we move forward and keep thinking about this corridor. So I've got some cost slides, and then we're going to move into some recommendations that came out of the study, and want to get some feedback from this group. And also, I don't know if we mentioned this up front, but if you do have questions as I'm going through here, please put those in the chat in the questions box, and we'll get to those at the end, and we can come back to slides and talk through anything in more detail if there are questions. But in looking at capital cost, just to summarize what some of our assumptions were in investments on the corridor, when we're increasing the service, we need a lot more buses to provide that service. So our cost estimates are including those new buses. It's also including investment at the stations and things like off-board fare collection and making the station's amenities more comfortable, things like that. We also are investing heavily proposing investing heavily in the intersections that help to support the transit vision here. Increasing safety and multimodal access is a really important thing. And then the BAT lanes, which I mentioned, which create those connections for transit. There's also some other items here with some of the station improvements. We're assuming that there will be some investment with pedestrian underpasses at some of those locations. And then in Longmont, the Kaufman project, we had to make some assumptions about how that cost would be shown. So we are including that cost, even though that may be excluded differently in the future, depending upon how things progress in the region. And then another note here, it's really important, is that we're still really early in the planning process on these items. And so there's a high level of contingency built in as the design continues to advance and the planning continues to advance. A higher level of certainty can be determined on these cost estimates. And so you'll see that as we move forward. So in total, that scenario that looked at the queue jumps at the key intersections and BRT improvement stations, things like that, we are showing it to be really a range between 184 million to 199 million. That cost range includes investments at 27 intersections along the corridor with varying levels of complexity that we've included. And then the second scenario that we looked at, this is exclusive of the first one. It actually includes all those same improvements in this cost, but in addition, it includes those BAT lanes in Longmont, Broomfield, and Lafayette. And that ranges from 214 to 233. And those are all in 2021 dollars. We didn't make assumptions about inflation, although recognizing that these projects would take place in the future and so likely would have some cost escalation that goes along with that. So we also looked at the operations costs of the buses. Increased service has an increased annual cost. And so all of the scenarios had a similar annual cost with the levels of service that we looked at, which all ranged around the $20 million mark for that service. That does include that Fort Collins to Denver Express connection, which is about half of that. It also includes all the other two service patterns that I had mentioned earlier. So with that, I'm going to move on to the recommendations that came out of the study. That's a lot of technical information. Thanks for bearing with me and my sick, crackly voice, trying to get through all this over a cold, but do appreciate your attention. As we look at the working towards Boulder County's transportation master plan goals, I mentioned that goal of increasing transit ridership, outpacing population and employment growth. There's a number of other goals that were defined in that plan that Boulder County has prioritized that this plan is really helping to advance. So as far as increasing countywide transit and ridership, focusing on investments that reduce VMT and provide service to underserved communities, and enhancing the corridor service in key travel corridors. Looking at the north-south transit connections and bus stop facilities and working with transit providers to optimize bus stop locations. And then again, partnering with communities that have anticipated increased travel between to and from Boulder County. So Boulder County is continuing to work through those items and is working towards those goals. Some of the key takeaways out of the study kind of align with some of those. Stakeholder input is a really important element in identifying a lot of the things that we've talked about, the alignments and the stations and the levels of investment. There's a lot of perspectives that help to contribute towards a vision for transit on this corridor. And that is a really critical part of what we've been doing. The transit investment on US 287 aligns with the TMP goals, Transportation Master Plan goals that I mentioned earlier. And then the operational changes are scenario one on US 287 would really provide some immediate travel time benefit with less upfront capital cost. So that's one thing to think about in the near term as looking at making that more efficient. And continued project development and benefit cost analysis, which is essentially looking at the ratios of cost to ridership and those types of things, will help to continue to refine the levels of BRT investments that will benefit the corridor the most. And lastly, a variety of funding sources really need to be investigated to advance this corridor as a whole and the projects that are contained within. With that, the recommendations, we've really kind of grouped those into near term over the next 2 years, midterm beyond that a few years, and then long term. Those near-term goals really are focused on that operational component, working with regional partners, RTD, CDOT, and Boulder County, and also the local communities to investigate that. And Boulder County, as they embark on the phase 2 study, is to continue to work with stakeholders and refine the design of these corridor concepts and investigating the funding opportunities for high priority improvements. And then for Boulder County to conduct a transit study countywide to look at the integration of this study with the 119 study with other transit projects that are taking place and are being planned, and look at that holistically as a county. In the midterm, we are recommending that the improvements at the intersections and the improvements at the BAT lanes continue along with the design and implementation, and that can happen individually or packaged as a whole. Kind of Jeff will talk a bit more about how that's phased in the next slide. And then longer term is really looking at the corridor as a whole and BRT improvements and station improvements and how that all connects together with the longer term planning that goes within that. So I'm going to pass it back to Jeff to talk a bit more about that implementation piece of the project. Go ahead, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Nick, for explaining our process and the outcomes of the modeling and scenarios, as well as recommendations for moving forward. And as we look into the next steps of this project, one of the concepts and one of the ideas that would make sense would be to take a phased approach, as opposed to building it all out at one time, find opportunities to meet multiple objectives along the way. And so likely be incremental, complementary projects that will build out the corridor over time. Could be looking at operations, could be looking at intersections, stations, and other types of treatments. Connections, of course, are important. And so we'll be looking at those moving forward. And so next slide, please, Nick. And then finally, to keep you all, let you know what's immediately coming, and we would encourage you to visit our website, which has come up, to stay involved. We will be working on a phase 2, which we didn't know was going to exist when we started this study, but we'd heard a lot from the community that safety was important, that multimodal connectivity was important. And so that led us to understand we need more exploration. And so phase 2, we're looking at early next year to get going on. Its project limits are going to be from the northern part of Colorado in Longmont at Colorado 66 to Broomfield in US 36. And then we thank our funding partners for helping with this, DRCOG and City of Longmont and Lafayette and Erie, City County of Broomfield helping fund this. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, partnerships are very critical to this. And then we're going to be looking at safety, intersections, and connections, mostly focused on that safety piece, calling it Vision Zero safety. And we will be looking at all modes. We're not going to be one particular mode. We're going to just be saying, what are the problems and how do we solve them? Boulder County has a Vision Zero policy, and we want to advance that. It will follow a federal funding process, and we will be looking at some environmental potential issues or non-issues along the way, just understanding how any projects could potentially impact the environment. And then this study is going to feed into that. And so, as I've mentioned, there could be an intersection that has big safety concerns and would also work well to put some sort of transit treatment there. And so we may be able to accomplish 2 things at once. And those types of projects would likely rise to the surface. And we want you all to stay involved. And we have a couple of questions in the chat, at least one, and we'll get to that here. So Nick, do you want to go to our next slide? And so wrapping up this one, it will happen this year, the feasibility study. We have this public meeting tonight, and then we're going to publish the draft report. We'll have opportunity for some review. And then once it's published to the website, we will have what we're calling a milestone, a public milestone, where we encourage the public to provide comments. We're gonna have some, we're not entirely sure what it's gonna look like yet, but we want to provide opportunity for the public to provide open-ended comments, talk about our process, maybe rate us, how we did, what we can do better next time, what we've done well now. And then I mentioned that phase 2 study starting in Q1 of next year. That is our goal. And we're working with Colorado Department of Transportation to move that along. And the continued partnerships are going to be vital in this. We want to continue working with all of our partners and expanding our partners and working with and for the members of the public. It's our pleasure to serve. And so we really want to encourage you to stay involved. You can visit our project website at boco.org/287 planning. You can check out the stations area toolkit that is applicable elsewhere. It's a very inspirational, aspirational toolkit. It's not a guide, and it could be helpful if there's development coming, or if you maybe just want to understand what potential options there would be for making transit better. And it's for this corridor, but it's applicable really to any corridor, although it's not a thou shalt do or anything like that. It's very inspirational. Our contact information is at the bottom. My email address is jbutts@bouldercounty.org, and then nick.vanderquack@acom.com. You can email either one of us. I sometimes like to take screenshots on these. So thank you all very much for joining us. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. And so I think I'll just go in order here, Nick. The first one I'm gonna give to you, Nick, and it's about how much the transit mode share means. You had talked around 2% mode share, and then you had talked a little bit about the throughput that we have there. But what is the real number of people that we can anticipate taking the bus? The question is, does 2% transit share mean that 1 in 50 travelers are going to take the bus? And is that only in peak hour, or did the model show anything about it being spread out?
It's a good question. I can help to clarify that. So that graphic that I showed was looking at person throughput on the corridor. And so to recap, that's one car with 3 people would count as 3 people in that number. And then 1 person on a bus would count as 1 person. And that number was a daily number. So I think the question asked, was it only in the peak hour? It was a daily number. And so a 2% mode share in those statistics does mean that 2% of the people are using the bus that are on that corridor, and the rest of the 98% are in vehicles. So that is what that means. There's a number of different ways that you can measure transit mode share. This is one. I won't go into details about the others, but this is looking at just overall the person movement on the corridor, what share of that is transit. So.
Great, thank you, Nick. Hopefully that helped answer your question. The next question I can take, and it's around a major intersection here, Colorado 52. And the question is, isn't the Highway 52 intersection about to be rebuilt? Is it a high priority from a study perspective? And the answer is yes to both of those. I was recently involved in a Colorado 52 planning study that extended from Weld County, Colorado, Road 79 to 119. And it included some analysis on 52, and it is an important intersection, and Colorado Department of Transportation has been working on a design for a while now, at least a year, probably longer, and I believe the plan is for that to go to construction within the next year or two. So hopefully that answers your question. And then The next question here is efforts underway regarding funding opportunities. And so Kathleen would like to mention this. So Kathleen, I'd like to welcome you to this. This is our Deputy Director of Transportation for Community Planning and Permitting. And so I told her she could just watch tonight, but this is a great question for you, Kathleen. So take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, and great presentation, Nick and Jeff and Rick. Appreciate all your help and all the work to have the interpretation as well for Spanish. So great job this evening, and I'm glad to see so many people participating. In terms of the question regarding funding sources that we're seeking, we're looking at a variety of options, both near-term and long-term funding sources to build out all of the vision for the corridor. We recognize this is a big price tag, both operationally and from a capital investment standpoint. And so that's part of the reason behind the phased approach. And so looking for different opportunities for funding locally, also looking at potential options with our partners, with RTD, with the Colorado Department of Transportation. And now with the new federal infrastructure bill, there could potentially be other opportunities to leverage our dollars here from Colorado with federal infrastructure opportunities. So we want to look at all of the above, and we recognize that we'll need to do this probably one step at a time, but that's really how all of our corridors come together, whether it's US 36 or some of our other projects that people are familiar with. It's going at it one piece at a time and really looking at partnerships and opportunities to leverage dollars. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen. I think that was a very thorough answer and always an important question. The final question we have, and if there's any more questions, please post them in the chat. We're happy to answer them. The final question, I think, Nick, is for you. You'd mentioned vehicle miles traveled reduction. Is there an estimate regarding the VMT reduction projected in this BRT project?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we did go through an exercise to look at the change in VMT between the scenarios. And there's several variables that go into that, including how that's changing car travel patterns, how that's changing increased number of buses and miles being driven with buses. And then also how other things that aren't related to this project change. When you start changing one thing, other things respond to that. So we went through the estimates on projecting that change and showed that it does decrease the automobile VMT on the corridor. And we are increasing, obviously, with more bus service, the bus VMT on the corridor. And the key metric is how does that combine together and what type of benefit does that produce? And that is highly variable depending upon how much service you're providing. And we talked a bit about a high level of service in this project, which may be refined to a little less or might continue to be what we're proposing here. But that all influences the total VMT calculations there. So we do have an estimate that also plays into, there's a calculator that the FHWA, the Federal Highway Organization, has that allows you to use those numbers to show emissions changes. And so we've got all those numbers that we've been looking at as part of this process, and are also highly aware of the fast pace of how technology is changing the electric and low emissions vehicles and buses, and the impact of all of that in these calculations as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And we will have this report posted to our website, boco.org/287planning, along with the stations area toolkit. And you can take a look and see those detailed numbers for yourself. And we would encourage you to do that. The next question we have is a very smart question, and they're thinking about the network, I think. And one thing I would just like to state, and Nick mentioned this in passing, but as we improve the transit on 287, there's a network of transit and it impacts all of the transit. And what we have shown is that this helps grow the transit mode share overall. It impacts other routes. And this question is specific around 36. And I don't know, Nick, if you have this answer. I think it's maybe an H-on question. He's the modeler and detail guy for those of you. And for comparison, do you know how the 2% transit mode share compares with the current mode share on 36? Do you happen to know that, Nick?
We didn't calculate that. We could calculate, that could be calculated with the information, the modeled information, but we can't calculate mode share for US 36. I will just say that US 36 has a lot higher ridership than US 287 does. It's got a much higher base currently and also looking in the future. And so I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but if that's something that could be explored, likely would be part of Boulder County's transit planning in the future.
And yeah, that's a great question. And then the next question we have here is, when the feasibility report comes out, is it draft IEG? Will there be opportunity for public comment? And the public is always at the center of what we do. And so we want to ensure that there is opportunity for comment. We are planning to do a project milestone, is what we call it, where we're able to provide the opportunity for the public to provide open-ended comments and detailed comments and multiple comments. And this comment is an important one and something that we'll need to figure out how to incorporate. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you very much for it. And if you have more questions, type them in the chat. Otherwise, please email myself, jbutts@Boulder County, or nick.vanderquack@aecom.com. Is there any other questions, or should we wrap this up tonight? All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I definitely appreciate it. Again, check out our website, boco.org/287 planning. Look at our materials that we have on there. There will be more coming, and we just really want to serve the public. And so we're going to be looking for those opportunities to continue to have a two-way conversation. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to our partners for helping make this possible. And thank you to those helping with the interpretation and helping record, and to Kathleen and to everybody for making this possible. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to, well, there's one last question. It just says, thank you all. And thank you for offering the Spanish. Thank you. It's our pleasure. Thank you for the comment. And with that last final comment, we are going to end this meeting, but we're not going to end the engagement. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.